Welcome back to Ethical Exits. On this episode, we're hosting Chris Michael, founder and managing director of EOT Advisors, the first U.S. firm dedicated to helping owners sell to an employee ownership trust. Chris has facilitated over $750 million in ownership transfers to 3,000 plus employees across 30 plus transactions, teaches at Rutgers, and also introduced the EOT structure to the U.S. market. In this episode, we'll strip the jargon and get super practical. What is an EOT, really? As Chris explains it, it's a simple, flexible model. No slicing the company into individual retirement accounts and no repurchase obligation when somebody leaves. He lays out why that simplicity matters on day one and every year after. We also talk speed and control. EOT transactions can close in as little as 2 months, and most US-based employee ownership deals are seller financed. Think buy now, pay later, using the company's own cash flow. No waiting on a bank to bless your dreams. Finally, we compare EOTs to ESOPs and co-ops in plain terms and touch on perpetual purpose trusts for founders who want to lock in mission. I think you'll enjoy Chris's no-nonsense style and the purpose-first way he approaches his work. And if you've ever said, I want ownership today and into the future that preserves what makes us great, our people, our culture, our purpose, this one's for you. Because employee ownership isn't just an exit strategy, it's a now strategy. Let's get into it.
All right, so today on Ethical Exits, we're joined by someone who has reshaped what's possible for business transitions in the US. Chris Michael is the founder and managing director of EOT Advisors, the first financial services firm in the country dedicated to helping business owners sell to an employee ownership trust. He's facilitated more than $750 million in capital assets, transferring to over 3,000 workers across 30 plus transactions. Chris introduced the EOT structure to the US. He's published in top journals like Tax Notes and Probate and Property, and teaches at Rutgers University, where he directs the Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing. So Chris, we're so grateful that you're here, and welcome to Ethical Exits.
Appreciate that so much, Caitlin and Hannah. It's really an honor to be on the program. Thank you so much.
It was such a pleasure to connect with you on the introductory call and get to know you a little bit more. But let's just start from the beginning. Let's start with your roots. So we like to always start all of our conversation with our guests, and we like to lay the foundation. And we like to ask, what values have guided you most deeply throughout your career and your life? And how have they shaped your path from educator to lawyer to EOT architect?
So I appreciate the question. It's also that's a question I'm interested in with my clients as well. Sort of what are the guiding principles or values, even from their childhood, that sort of shape the direction of their company and their decision about how to exit from their company. For me, dinner table conversations were about things like workers and workers' rights. My grandparents were active in the workers' rights and civil rights movements. My parents, as good boomers, were involved in the anti-war movement. And so it's just kind of the lifeblood of my family. And, when I was at a point in my life sort of trying to figure out what to do for a living, with my life professionally, and I learned about employee ownership, and it was just instantaneous. I mean, it was like, oh, this exists in the real world. That's amazing. Had no idea really, until just dedicated myself wholeheartedly to supporting employee ownership in any way that I could. And so that did involve going to graduate school for a PhD, and I ultimately wrote a PhD dissertation, 300 plus page book on the history of employee owned businesses in the United States, going back to the 1800s and early 1900s, forthcoming as a published work. I also went to law school just to see why not? I might be helpful. The law degree might be helpful in some way or another. And I sort of walked myself backwards somehow into becoming a financial advisor, which I never in my wildest imagination would have thought that I would become a financial advisor or M&A advisor. Never even heard the term M&A actually when I was in undergraduate. that's sort of my background in terms of employee ownership trusts and founding EOT Advisors. It was one of my strong concerns from my sort of first point of entry into the employee ownership space. That was about 15, 16 years ago. That there was some sustainability to the structure. I'd heard about employee-owned businesses getting sold out from the employee ownership, and it just seemed like, well, wow, this is a lot of time and energy going into converting and building these businesses. And so there was a concern for the sustainability of the enterprise under employee ownership. And I think what actually started to even become more of a concern over the years that I was started to get involved in employee ownership was that this would be a smooth process for the exiting seller. The employee stock ownership plan, which is of course the main form of employee ownership in the United States and has been for half a century, and it's a wonderful model. And I wrote my dissertation is basically from some time ago when I was writing my dissertation. It was basically a long book saying how great ESOPs are, so it's a fantastic structure. But nevertheless, they do, they're a challenging approach when it comes to exiting a business. I think anybody would fairly say that. And worker cooperatives, of course, come with their own challenges, as do direct share ownership plans. And so thinking about how we might offer a way for business owners to exit to employee ownership in a simpler, more streamlined fashion, that became my overriding concern, more so even, I would say, than the matter of sustainability. Let me pause there.
And that's a great leadway into the next question. Because you're talking about how, this learning about the employee ownership world and what it can do for companies and what structures work best with, certain types of business models. But to explain in layman's terms to our viewers who are just learning about EOTs, can you explain what they are and how they differ from the two other structures that you noted, which are ESOPs and co-ops or cooperatives, as many people know them?
Sure. I think the best place to start actually is just to spell out very plainly what employee ownership even is. So employee ownership has been agreed upon for almost 200 years. It involves three things. It involves sharing the financial rewards among sort of more or less the whole team of employees. It involves a management structure, a governance that has an obligation to act in the best interests of the team. And the third piece would sort of as a downstream sort of result of perhaps of having a management structure acting in the best interest of the employees is that it's a great place to work. It's got a great culture, right? And every employee owner, every co-partner feels a sense of dignity about their participation in the enterprise and the way in which they're valued. And you get all three of those things with an ESOP, an EOT, worker cooperative, a direct share ownership plan. With an EOT, although our work has been to bring the EOT to the United States, well, where did you bring it from? The EOT has been more or less the mainstream form of employee ownership in England for 100 years. And I think it's just I don't want to get into the weeds right now, but, the ESOP kind of became the main approach in the U.S. And the main difference between these two approaches is that with an ESOP, you are slicing and dicing the company up into shares, as you would ordinarily with a stockholder company, Susie gets these many shares, Bobby gets these many shares, etc., right? And when you retire, those shares are repurchased from you. What's more is that this approach has been, is now there's sort of a Employee Retirement Income Security Act, federal law, ERISA wrapper. So it's actually regulated like a 401k. Whereas in EOT, while it's very flexible, you can do a lot of different things with an EOT. You can provide equity-like rewards to employee owners. But the keep it simple default structure for an EOT is you don't slice and dice the company. The shares kind of as a lump go into the trust and are held in the trust, more or less kind of forever. It doesn't have to be forever, but, and so it's not the case that sort of Susie has this much ownership and Bobby has this much ownership. We all own the company as a group. And then there are rules, built into the trust as to how we divvy up the, fruits of our labor, how we divvy up the profits. I don't know if this is a horrible example or a helpful example, but I sometimes say that I had my stepmother was from Minnesota and spent a little bit of time out there. And I got the sense that everybody's grandfather left the family a cabin up north in Minnesota. There's always a cabin up north in Minnesota. And so, when the family cabin up north is left to the family, it's not that cousin Susie owns the second bedroom on the left on the top floor and cousin Bobby owns the right to dip his toes in the creek in the front yard, but nobody else has the right to dip their toes in the creek. We share ownership of this as a family. And then there are, of course, common sense rules as to how we share ownership, like every beneficiary. I don't know what these rules might be, but every beneficiary gets 1 weekend summer or something, like 1 week of summer. There's ways to do this in a sensible fashion. And so with profit, you might wonder, well, what are these rules often, how do these rules often work in an EOT? The rules for profit sharing in EOT work. This is kind of established international ethical standard for a long time now, which is that you would usually divide the profits of the company up in accordance with some formula based on compensation, seniority, and hours worked.
And that doesn't have to be the same type of rules for every company, right? They
Correct.
can write their own rules into place.
Correct. And one of the key pieces here, of course, is that, for people who are really steeped in the ESOP approach, which again is a wonderful approach, there's no repurchase obligation when somebody leaves the company. I have my most valuable sort of MVP, most valuable employee who's been with my company for 20 years and owns this big chunk of share, and then I'm paying them to leave because they have maybe one of the largest chunks of shares. I'm paying them to exit. Whereas with an EOT, I'm quoting the English here. The English have an expression with respect to EOTs, so I can't get in trouble because I'm quoting the English. Naked in, naked out. So naked in, naked out. You're not purchasing shares when you come into the company, and you're not being bought out of shares when you leave. And, also have to say, this is really the approach of a standard law partnership. The EOT approach to financial sharing. When you make partner at some fancy white shoe law firm, right? I'm open to being corrected on this, but my understanding is that, when you make partner at a big fancy white shoe law firm, there's a kind of technically you have to kind of buy your ownership interest. It might be like $10,000 or something like that, right? And then your rewards are the year after year profits per partner that you get, which could be, $1 million a year on top of a base salary of $300,000, or that was at least a few years ago. It's probably even more right now. And when you retire 30 years later, what you get for your ownership interest when you sell it back to the firm? $10,000. It's not your many business owners think of the typical sort of, you found the company, you grow the company, and you sell the company, and your payout is on the exit. But, for professional partnerships, that's actually not how they work. And so the EOT model is really like a professional partnership model. It's just that, in a professional partnership, of course, the partnership is typically limited to the professionals in the firm, the licensed professionals, architects, CPAs, engineers, medical doctors, lawyers. Whereas here, everybody's included. If you've been with the company for about a year or so, give or take, you're included.
I've never heard that cabin example. That is genius. I think you should continue to use that. It's really helpful, very colorful, explaining the difference between ESOPs and EOTs. And to your point, ESOPs are their own animal. They have their own purpose, right? They can be very cumbersome to administer. They can be very expensive to not only form, but to operate, maintain, manage, due to the annual process of evaluating how much the company is worth, and then determining how much the shares are worth, and then of course, as you touched on, the pressure that it can create when people exit, when tenured people leave. We actually told a lot of that story through the New Belgium brewing exit. When they're through their ESOP process and why they sold and everything that happened there. It's a really interesting story. And can you touch a little bit too on cooperatives? Because you mentioned this buy-in, right? Which I understand, or I understood, was more applicable with a cooperative model. I wasn't sure though how it worked for an EOT or an ESOP.
No, there's no buy-in with the EOT. I was just, the point there was the comparison to a professional, like a law firm, right? Where there's this kind of nominal buy-in, but the financial rewards are not like an ESOP with a big payout when you retire. The financial rewards are the year-over-year profit sharing. That's it.
Well,
and Chris, I'm sure you worked with, all different people who have founded businesses in all different industry sectors of all different sizes and ownership dynamics. But when it comes to an EOT, what are the certain types of businesses and, team cultures where EOTs work especially well?
I think for me, I think that falls back to kind of a general employee ownership question. I think there's a certain threshold above, below which, an employee ownership transition of any kind won't make sense. You need a little bit of a management bench if you're going to do employee ownership. And if it's a 3-person company, and the one of those people who's the main entrepreneur founder is retiring and there's only 2 people left, that just starts to get a little bit, it's sort of a little bit thin, I think, for doing an employee ownership transition. But if you have, if your company can support a management team of 3 or 4 people, 5 people, then, who could step in as managers, as board directors, then I think we're probably big enough to do an employee ownership transition, and that could really be any model of employee ownership. Mm-hmm. That being said, I've heard it said that there's a legal minimum of 10 employees to retain the benefits of an S Corp ESOP. And so there's a little story in there that involves Jerry Seinfeld, which is near and dear to my heart. But I won't get into that at the moment. But so there's 10 employee minimum for the S Corp ESOP, and for that reason, many folks would say, well, you should have just keeping in mind the legal floor. You might think about wanting at least 20 employees in case there's any fluctuation in the employee count at your business. You wouldn't want to fall below that 10 employee threshold. So I would say when I think about whether or not a company, can do an employee ownership transition, I just think about it in terms of this sort of general issue, not so much an ESOP versus EOT versus direct share ownership versus co-op kind of a question, but just whether or not there's enough of a kind of a management team that the company can support that would, warrant or enable a transition to happen.
And Chris, and when it comes to expenses, when it comes to like implementation costs of these different employee ownership structures, do they all cost the same, or is one more expensive to transition than the other?
Well, sure, yeah. So ESOP is known to be a bit of an expensive tool to implement. And won't get into the weeds on what those costs are, but they're significantly more expensive, I would say, both in terms of the initial implementation and then ongoing costs, not to mention the potential costs of litigation in the future that you have to you might think to want to factor in. And then depending on how you think about it, if in terms of cash flow, you also have to factor in purchase obligations with the ESOP. But that's easily Googleable. So, yeah.
So let's talk about a little bit about those transition mechanics. If I think through, and if I'm understanding you, Chris, about why you like the EOT, I think you said 2 things. You said that the transition can be relatively fast, or it's not as cumbersome, if I heard you correctly. And then also the permittability of an EOT, or what you can do with the trust, and how that varies from an ESOP or a co-op, which Caitlin and I understand in the land of M&A. You sell your company, that ESOP can be dissolved that next day. Same thing with a cooperative, right? The trust is a mechanism where you can lock in what that trust purpose is, as you said, for life. Or for a very long period of time. We just had Brenna Davis on from Organically Grown Company, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Their company, they were one of the first to transition in the U.S. to a perpetual purpose trust. And as she explained it to us, perpetual purpose trusts have been used traditionally for graveyard sites, which makes sense, right? That land forever, in perpetuity, would be used for a graveyard. You know, you'd have a nice spot for anybody to live there throughout or to be buried there throughout their eternity, which makes sense, right? So that historical application, being leveraged in this instance for a business. And as we know, also Patagonia coming out and saying Earth is now our shareholder, right? These kind of declarative statements that are more, I guess, qualitative in nature. Like, this is what we care about, and this is how we're going to protect it for the long term. So am I correct there? That's why you've leaned in to, and what you do principally, although you're very familiar, you understand how the mechanics of all these other two models work. This is kind of why you put your money, or you put your butt in the seat, Chris, on EOTs. You didn't start your business just to sell something. You started it to solve something. But solving big problems with limited resources, it's slow, it's hard. And in a market moving this fast, values need more than vision. They need velocity. This is the kind of challenge Up and Over Advisors was born to solve. We help mission-driven companies scale smarter through values-amplifying acquisitions. Because when ethical founders grow, capitalism gets an upgrade. We do the heavy lifting to find and qualify companies ready to partner or sell to someone like you. We don't just close deals, we open doors to broader impact. Ready to scale yours? Let's build the future on purpose. Visit upandoveradvisors.com to learn more.
Well, so, from my clients, oftentimes, their business is, entrepreneurs are like artists, right? They're very creative people.
Yeah.
And sometimes people spend 40 years alone in a room, and they have one novel they've created, and that's their masterpiece. For a business owner, they're out there in the world, they're working with people, vendors, partners, customers, employees, and their business is their masterpiece. It's their life's work. And so, when you come time to want to exit, you have a challenging question, in front of you, right? Do I want to sell to a competitor who might close my shop, take my customer list, take a few employees, but axe some others? Do I want to sell it to a private equity firm or investor group? And, they're going to promise, all sorts of things when we first start negotiations, but they're never going to put it in writing. 2 years down the line, they're never going to put anything in writing when it comes to the contract. Or do I want my business to kind of stand up on its own 2 feet and sort of move forward in the world without me as the owner? And so, whether it's a sale to an employee ownership trust or a perpetual purpose trust, which we also do, it offers a great opportunity for business owners to sell their business, see their masterpiece sort of thrive and stand up on its own 2 feet, and also offers, I think, a very handsome financial return as well, given that the owner, of course, has the time to wait for payout over a period of years. But it's a fantastic solution for exiting business owners who want to see their business continue to thrive in just the way that they built it.
have a little bit more control, right?
Sure. And to that, yes, correct.
Right.
And so, earlier you had asked, what was really some of my guiding principles here in thinking about developing the EOT and the PPT here in the United States. And the guiding principle was first, not just that it was a fast process, but really that it was a safe process, a comfortable process, an easy process, a simple and straightforward process that does permit a significant degree of, control over the process, right? That I think, when I entered your recording studio just now for the virtual recording studio, it said something, the first thing that came up was rolling out the red carpet. It's funny because that's exactly what I say about this, is that when when a business owner raises their hand and says, hi, hey, advisor community over here, I'm thinking of doing something like employee ownership or some kind of social purpose exit. Yeah. We should be rolling out the red carpet for this person. We shouldn't be presenting them with challenges and obstacles, right? We should be rolling out the red carpet. And so that's really what has become sort of first and foremost my concern, is that we're able to kind of roll out the red carpet for exiting business owners who want to do something kind of socially minded or employee oriented with their business.
Chris, I love that. I mean, it's a big part of why we have this podcast, and why a lot of the work that we do is, how can we democratize knowledge? How can we lift the floor, right? How can we help people make choices that are more in line with their value system, right? I think that's such a noble purpose. So cool, especially, when I think about, you've participated in the wealth transfer of over 750 million in capital assets to 3,000 employees. I mean, my God, that is a massive ripple effect, right? That one person can have. And by making it easy for people to approach these transitions, because I can tell you, Chris, I've been in rooms with B Corp founders, most recently, CEOs, right? Where the prospect of taking a 5-year transition, let's say, succession planning, and then an EO transition today, Chris, in this market where we're faced with so many existential threats, they're throwing their hands up. They're like, I can't go there. I'm thinking about.
I'm sorry, you said 5 years? I'm not sure following.
Well, yeah, sure. Well, we've talked to folks where they've taken 5 years. So they'll first do the leadership transition, and then they transition, to make sure that they have good succession planning. And then they'll make the move to employee ownership. And I think there's a lot of value in taking your time and not moving slow. But I think in this environment, right? In this environment where folks are, because you have to be a profitable business, you have to be a stable business in order to make these transitions, right? To sell to your employees, that doesn't go away. That requirement doesn't go away. So in this environment where things are tentative for a lot of folks, or there's a lot of fear and FUD, or there's just a lot of consternation in business markets, especially if you're attached to a global supply chain today, with the tariff environment, making this easier and more straightforward. And as you said, rolling out the red carpet, I hadn't thought of it that way, Chris, but man, I double tap on that. I think that's really, really a viable and a really important initiative. So kudos to you for thinking of it that way and pursuing it that way.
I appreciate that. With our clients, we've closed EOT transactions as quickly as in 2 months. It's often the case that we might kind of take a little more time just to kind of go at a slightly easier pace, and that might be over the course of 6 months. But that's really sort of 2 months of work just kind of spread out over 6 months, And then we work on a flat fee basis, which my clients always appreciate. And so, it might if somebody wants to take a year and a half with it, that's fine too. It's still the same flat fee. And, the leadership succession can happen before the transaction or after the transaction. So, some of my clients prefer to, already have that in place before they ever call me. And some of them put it into place a year or two after we conclude working together. But the process itself, when a client is really ready to go, it can be as quick as 2 months.
Wow. Amazing. So I think the people traditionally think about employee ownership transitions as a succession plan, right?
Yeah.
This is an exit
Yes.
traditionally. That's how
Yes.
people think about it. Seems to be a lot more energy, especially in particular in ESOP community, around acquisitions that are driven by or layered in with employee ownership is the fastest way that the movement grows, right? The fastest way you get more employee owners, right? Broad-based employee ownership, regenerative wealth transfer is through acquisition, using employee ownership structures as an acquisition strategy as well. Curious on your thoughts on that. If you're seeing any new innovations in the space, if you've helped companies leverage employee ownership as an acquisition strategy, whether that means that they buy a company and then transition the whole thing to an EOT, or if they transition to an EOT and then start acquiring companies.
I think it's a really interesting point that you're raising, and you're absolutely right. It's very exciting, the growth that we're seeing in ESOPs through acquisition, and I have some friends who've actually been studying that and publishing on that topic. So it's a very exciting aspect of ESOPs, that they're able to leverage their structure to do acquisitions. I have some clients that have, I don't think that's necessarily going to be the name of the game in the EOT sort of space. I do have some clients that were sort of already working on an acquisition or two before they met me, before we transitioned. They concluded the acquisition after we transitioned to an EOT. So certainly, just as possible, plausible, workable under an EOT as it would be any typical business, any typically owned business. But I'm not sure that we're going to see the same kind of growth, but I could be wrong. But with an ESOP, it certainly is really exciting, the growth through acquisitions that's being done right now. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that it makes so much sense from an ESOP structure, because of the free cash flow that you get from, as you described it, the ERISA wrapper, that it is seen by the federal government as a retirement plan. So it frees up a lot of capital that would otherwise go to paying taxes as a business to now cash flow. And how do you spend that cash flow and to get the best return for your ESOP, right? For your employees too.
Absolutely.
So that makes a ton of sense. But what Caitlin and I are really interested in, and we hope someone takes this up on, we'd love to work with a company that is using, these ESOP models could also be transferable within a company, right? You can use them at different phases of your business. As you mentioned, the ESOPs have to be a little bit larger because of the cost to get there and the administrative cost to manage an ESOP. But leveraging the ESOP model as to free up cash flow to do acquisitions, and then once you get to a place where you feel pretty good, you got a large P&L, you got a lot of different employee owners, you feel really good about the structure. Then that piece comes into play was like, okay, now might be more vulnerable to an outside buyer, right? Who could
that's correct.
gobble you up, right?
That's correct.
And dissolve the ESOP. So at that point, then transitioning to an EOT to be like, okay, let's wrap this up.
That's something that we've played with over the years. The idea of transition is a very great question, Hannah. The idea of switching from an ESOP to an EOT. There's some in the weeds reasons why that's not so workable, practically speaking. But it would certainly be nice if we could do something like that. But it's a bit tricky, a bit in the weeds, but that's a little. I've spoken with some ESOP companies who said we want to exit out of our ESOP. We don't need an ESOP. We just want to be an EOT. This is too much for us, really. The founder got his money 20 years ago. We haven't seen the founder for 20 years, like literally. So really successful employee-owned company, right? In that sense, it really is standing on its own 2 feet. It's just that 30, 40 years down the road, they didn't need the ESOP itself. The EOT would have been just fine for them and less burdensome. But it's just for technical reasons, it's sort of a little tricky to make that happen. But maybe get some regulatory changes in the future, perhaps. And nothing I'm sort of digging into or counting on by any stretch. I think the ESOP is a great structure. It's a wonderful tool. It stands all by itself as a wonderful tool. And so I'm not particularly, I sort of think there's a sort of fork in the road to sort of decide to go down a little more down the ESOP path or down the EOT path. I don't sort of see those roads as crossing again as much in the future.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So let's think a little bit more about EOTs. You've talked about it as being not just a systems change, but like a cultural shift for revolution. How we think about business and their purpose.
Okay. I don't put words in my mouth. And I would say, again, EOT is a structure that's been around for 100 years. John Lewis was the noted proponent of this in England in the 1920s, right? Mm-hmm. And we actually had. I sort of speculate that John Lewis might have gotten the idea actually originally from the United States. So while we ordinarily say that the EOT comes from England, I found examples of the EOT in the U.S. as far back as in the 1890s and also the 1920s as well, 20s, 30s. And so it's possible it was here first. So it's a very robust, stable approach to transitioning a business. And in fact, I have a colleague in Japan, and as best we can tell it, some of the oldest employee-owned companies in the world use, I might be mistaken about this, but use something like an EOT approach, I would say. And these are businesses in Japan that are like 700 years old. They do carpentry at the temples. So I think it's a very stable and conservative approach, when it comes to selling one's business. And I think for all of my clients, I would say basically all of them, it's really not a culture shift, actually. Really? It's really maintaining, this is their masterpiece and a big part of any business, right? Half of all management books are psychology books, right? And it's true. So true. It's true. Yeah. And a mentor of mine said that one time to me. And so the culture is half the business, And so for I think all of my clients, preserving their masterpiece is really about preserving the wonderful culture they built at the firm. Mm. I mean, I think if you want to talk about culture shift, there might be this issue which they have in England as well, where, some people just, gosh darn it, they really are stuck on the idea of each employee owning some, X number of shares in the company. Yeah. And that's, and then some people that doesn't really mean much to them. And they're happy to think of this as the shares being held as a group, for all of the employees. And they have that kind of, there's sort of different approach in England, as well. So I think, in introducing this as an approach in the U.S., we've, encountered a little bit of resistance perhaps among some service providers, because that's sort of how they've been oriented towards thinking about ownership for half a century now. And again, it's a wonderful approach. It's just that there are indeed other approaches to sharing ownership. It's all shared ownership. It's just different approaches to sharing ownership.
Chris, did you, speaking of, the model coming from the UK here to the US, when it comes to like financing challenges, I'm just curious, because I know that like banks and lenders in the US were familiar with ESOP loans, but when it comes to like EOTs and underwriting those deals, they were more apprehensive or hesitant.
I wouldn't say that actually. Okay. Yeah, I wouldn't say that at all. So employee ownership in the United States for the past 30 years is it's seller finance. These are seller finance transactions. Yeah. So the typical standard ESOP transaction is 100% seller financed. Mm-hmm. So I'm really fortunate right now. Most of the people that call me already know that, and I set up a few years ago to get securities licenses and to help people. And got registered. to help people to raise private capital for these transactions, but people just didn't want it. They know that this is seller financed, and they appreciate the level of control that brings them moving forward. Now, it is the case that for a long time, larger ESOP transactions might involve 30 or 40% bank financing for the transaction. So, a $50 million, $100 million company, you can pull out bank financing and leverage that to complete the ESOP transaction. But that's not the typical ESOP transaction, right? Typical ESOP transaction is a 50 to 100 person company.
Yep.
That's 100% seller financed. And so that's the same way it is with the EOT. Typical EOT transaction is a 50 to 100 employee company. And it's 100% seller financed. So I don't see that as an obstacle in any kind of way.
Oh, that's great. Okay. Good to hear. I thought there was more resistance from that, but
no.
We're learning as we go. So
Sure.
We're learning from the expert today. So this is great.
What else has been thinking about the differences between the UK routes, even though you've mentioned that you've seen examples of this in other parts of the world and certainly in the States as well. But as you're transitioning, you're bringing more companies in America to the EOT model. And evangelizing it? What have been some of the challenges that you've encountered or misconceptions about that's made it a little bit? I don't know. You seem so positive. Maybe it hasn't been that hard.
I am pretty positive about this. I don't think there haven't been really challenges. I mean, I think so. My kind of seminal article on this when I was doing sort of original research and writing and publication around the EOT, was, for this American Bar Association publication, Probate and Property. And that article is freely available on my website, EOTadvisors.com. It's, called the Employee Ownership Trust and ESOP Alternative. And really the discovery there was that we can do an employee ownership trust today. At that time, that was 10 years ago when we brought this over here to the US. And, the discovery there was we can do an employee ownership trust today in any state in the country. And we don't need any regulatory changes and we don't need any legal changes. We're ready to go. As a professional, there's the natural desire to be careful and cautious in terms of implementing a new tool, right? But I don't think that was a challenge. That was just being prudent.
So that's very encouraging, because I think the perpetual purpose trust, which is very similar to an EOT. Can you actually explain the difference between those two things for our audience?
So our original sort of research, my original research around this, and this was back in 2015. That was in my article on tax notes. And I was sort of figuring out how to bring the employee ownership trust, how to implement the employee ownership trust in the US. And I discovered back in 2015 that we had this new creature that nobody in the social purpose world was using, called the non-charitable purpose trust, with or without ascertainable beneficiaries.
Big firm expertise, values-driven impact. At Impact GC, we've traded the traditional law firm playbook for one built on purpose and trust. As a pending B Corp, member of 1% for the Planet, and certified carbon neutral law firm by We Are Neutral, we help mission-driven businesses grow, protect their purpose, and lead with confidence. We're here to make the complex simple and the legal work human. Let's build what matters. Visit impactgclaw.com to learn more.
It's a statutory name, varies state by state. Sometimes it's just without ascertainable beneficiaries. So this thing called a non-charitable purpose trust was brand new in the United States and really brand new to the world of trust law internationally. And for the most part, I mean, it was used just a little bit in like the Isle of Jersey, one of these sort of British Channel Islands, but it wasn't even on the mainland of Britain. But this device, the non-charitable purpose trust, had been introduced, I think 2004, forget which was the first state, but it was introduced by an attorney named Alexander Bove Jr. And he's still a practicing attorney today. And when he introduced it in 2004 in his article in the same journal I published in Probate and Property, he was introducing it more as just a standard business succession planning tool. And I think, I'm not really particularly big on credit claiming, but bringing something from one country to another country, not a big deal really. Yeah. My only sort of minor intellectual contribution here was to go, aha, we can bring the EOT over from Britain, and we can kind of use this new non-charitable purpose trust vehicle for the employee ownership. And for that matter, we could use it for any social purpose ownership. So, I've worked with other companies too, and I've advised other kind of activists or advocates, in the steward ownership world or the purpose ownership world, that they should consider using the non-charitable purpose trust as the device that they're going to use. So that resulted in, companies like Organically Grown Company and Patagonia, I believe, in using the non-charitable purpose trust. We've come to call it the perpetual purpose trust, but the statutory name for this entity type is a non-charitable purpose trust. And, I work with clients who do both. And, the difference is primarily, well, what's your purpose? If you want the purpose to be employee ownership, then you can call it an employee ownership trust. And if you want it to be the Hannah and Caitlin save the world and create great podcasts while you're at it trust, you can call it that. That could be your non-charitable purpose, Yeah.
Yeah. But that's why I push back on you, because I do think that that's a cultural shift, right? It's this idea that we're pushing in culture, and an idea that business should also serve a purpose beyond enrichment, right?
Oh, that's a fair point. Sure.
Right. Yeah. So I think that when you talk to people, and we have, some, and we plan on doing more talking to people about these transitions, not just as a succession plan, but as a growth strategy, a mission-aligned growth strategy, where if your company or product or service is all about curbing climate change, well, this could be a great way to accelerate your impact, right?
Absolutely.
Mission achievement.
Yeah.
And so we just joined our principal business up and over advisors. We joined the National Coalition for Employee Ownership, which is there's a lot of ESOPs companies.
National Center for Employee Ownership, NCEO.org. Yeah, great organization.
Yeah, great organization. And we joined them, and we're hope to attend their conference, their next 2026.
They put on wonderful conferences. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot going on there, but as we talk to folks, and this is, an overgeneralization, it's not binary in any way, but ESOPs being used by traditional capitalists who maybe don't have a purpose beyond enrichment, traditional forms of leveraging capitalism as a form to enrich themselves, versus folks who are considering an EOT or PPT, perpetual purpose trust, maybe thinking about the purpose of their business is something entirely different.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the B Corp people, I think at the B end Corp of the day, and it's been a fantastic movement to watch from the sidelines, to watch that grow over the years. And, the person who connected us was, of course, Miran Oka from Oka Aquatics, one of our clients. The swim school in Miami, chain of swim schools in Miami. And, she's such a big B Corp proponent and advocate. And there's so many wonderful entrepreneurs, business owners who have really seized on the idea of a benefit corporation. It is wonderful to see. And I would heartily agree with you. That is a kind of a cultural shift, although you'll find traces of it earlier in U.S. history, but it's really kind of taken shape and it's become institutionalized, which is extremely important, through the work of the B Corp people and the B Lab people. And I think that, a lot of the B Corp founders, I think, working with EOT Advisors to do their PPT, B Corp exit, I think it was a really, really natural fit. A really, really natural fit. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, super cool. I mean, I think that's the work that you're doing there, and the way that what my conclusion from what you've shared with us, which I think is really, really powerful. There are two hesitancies that we see. People think about either a succession or as leveraging employee ownership as an acquisition strategy, or even just using an acquisition strategy. Is how long is it going to take? How complicated is it? And how can I even afford it? Where's the capital going to come from? So you've really kind of condensed those things for us, and my thinking and what you shared here today, which I think is super cool, is that these transitions can be fast.
Oh, yeah.
When you've decided that this is the path, and as Caitlin highlighted, and as Mirren highlighted, and Brenna highlighted, there's so many different ways that you can set up this trust with how it's governed and what its purpose is, and how it does the profit waterfall and how it shares its revenues, all this stuff. There's so much flexibility in there. So once you decide that you wanted to go this path, there's advisors like you who can really step on the gas, roll out the red carpet, and make it quick and fast for you. And then you're seeing not a lot of friction in the capital markets or from banks or from how you might finance a transition like this, because folks are using seller financing in order to make these transitions.
That's exactly right, Hannah. I totally agree with all of that. And I would say if there's somebody out there who isn't ready to step on the gas, we work like a standard M&A shop. And so, I tell everybody, it's the first thing I say when I meet a potential client. I am more than happy to have half a dozen phone calls or Zoom meetings with you, your partner, your CPA, your attorney, and you can find out everything you wanted to know about employee ownership trusts or perpetual purpose trusts, but we're afraid to ask. As we can just, usually I'm in there and they'll ask me an hour's worth of questions, and then the next call, their partner will be on the phone and they'll ask me all the same questions a second time. And then they'll bring the CPA out of, so we'll go through the same questions 3 or 4 times. And I always say it's no problem. I mean, as you guys can tell, I'm kind of a chatty Cathy, right? So I'm happy to kind of keep going over, through this and inform people. And I want people to know that it's the right fit for them before they even engage me. Before we're even talking about a formal engagement. This is all free. This is all, free conversation if people want to have with me about whether this is a good fit for them.
I want to ask one more question there. Thank you for that. That's super cool. I'm so glad that you're so open. And you're not only a chatty Cathy, but you're very passionate. Like this, this is for who you are, right?
I can't help it. Can't help it, Anna. And I told you about those dinner tables when I was a kid. It was had an impact.
High impact. And you use the word dignity, and I think that's such a beautiful word to describe it. The work that you're doing and what you believe in, and there's so much power in treating people and giving them agency for their own dignity. I think that is huge, man. If there's one gift that we can give another human, is that. The power of dignity. I think that's so transformative. So that choked me up a little bit. It's really cool, the work that you're doing and how passionate you are about it. One of the things that we've also gotten questions about, or people talk about, even most recently, I was talking to someone about this, when the leadership team is considering a transition like this, any one of the employee ownership models, what is your take on them talking openly to their staff about these plans or involving them in the decision-making process? What's your take on that?
Well, I would look to history, and I would just point out that, ESOPs have had just this amazing track record in the United States at creating employee ownership, and we've just never seen anything like it, like anywhere in the world. And I think one of the amazing things that Lou Kelso, who is the kind of the guy who's credited with creating the ESOP in the United States, it used to be called the Kelso Plan. Although I would like to point out that John Menke, who worked with Luke Helso and created Menke and Associates, and they've actually, John Menke, who's a friend and a mentor, and I just think the world of him. And he was the one who kind of rolled up his sleeves as soon as ERISA was passed and opened up the first ESOP shop, and has done more ESOP deals than anybody else. The way these Menke and John and others have been able to do these and Luke Helso before him have been able to do these transitions so successfully is, again, I think they keep it, even everything that we were saying about the ESOP, it's still a fairly streamlined process, right? Where the business owner hires their advisors. And it's complicated, but they get through the process. You mentioned New Belgium earlier, and I have another friend, Marianne Beister. Her father founded SAIC, which is a famous employee-owned company, and she made a documentary called We the Owners about employee ownership, and they featured New Belgium in that documentary. It's great. It's now free online, wetheowners.com, I think. And in that movie, they show it. Feel somebody out there can correct me if I'm mistaking this, but I think they show the scene when the owners of New Belgium sold to an ESOP, and the day they let all the employees know. They didn't let them know 2 years before. I don't think before the process began, right? They had everybody sit down in these sort of metal chairs out in one of the main rooms, and it's a big, it's an industrial facility, brewery, right? And they said, we sold the company, and everybody, you can see the look on everybody's faces, they're all freaking out, right? And they say, well, if you want to see who we sold the company to, there's a yellow envelope under everybody's chair, and you can see there who we sold the company to. So everybody's still kind of freaking out. What are we going to see on it? Is this going to be my pink slip, And they reach down, they bend over, they pull out the yellow envelope, and they pull out a mirror. It's such a beautiful scene, So, the way that the ESOP has developed and grown and been such a transformative force in the U.S. for, a not insignificant percentage of the American private sector workforce, it's primarily been in these transactions that are, it's the seller hiring their advisors. And so, I don't know if somebody wants to involve the workforce in the transition. I think that would be a little bit, it would buck the trend of how these things are typically put together as, standard in the United States. Yeah.
I like the way you think about these things. The way that you problem solve is really clear. Like, well, let's see what's worked in the past. Okay, that probably is a good way to lead into. Super cool. I didn't hear that story actually about the mirrors. That's amazing.
You can watch We the Owners and wetheowners.com. That's the scene in the documentary. Yeah.
Very cool. Awesome.
Yeah, give me chills. Definitely going to check that out after this.
Oh.
But Chris, thank you so much for being here today. And like Hannah said, the work you're doing is so important, and how you're spreading awareness about EOTs and employee ownership it's fantastic. And we always love to wrap up our conversations with this question. But Chris, what is one cause or idea you'd encourage our listeners to explore? Or if they want to learn more about what you do and, employee ownership, where can they connect with you directly?
Well, I really appreciate those questions, and I knew you would be asking that, so put a little bit of thought into it. For either of those things, I would suggest people might think about donating to the cause of employee ownership, for the idea of employee ownership, and there are a number of really wonderful organizations that you can put your charitable dollars towards. And whether it's thinking about where you might best direct your philanthropic dollars, or if it's thinking about doing an employee ownership or perpetual purpose trust transition, I'd encourage you to put some time on my calendar. And if you forget the following, you can always go to EOTadvisors.com and just click the Calendly free consultation button link there. But if you can remember, my personal scheduling link, which I'll put out there into the ether here, is EOTadvisors.com/Chris. And I'd invite you to put an hour down on my calendar and we can talk about which organizations to donate to, or we can talk about, employee ownership trusts, perpetual purpose trusts, and ask every question 3 times. And I'd be, again, happy to go over all of this. Everything you just heard in the podcast, we could talk about again. It's really such a pleasure. And, meeting business owners, my clients, is really one of the best parts of my life right now, is the friends I've made through my clients. And so, I'd look forward to meeting you, whoever you are out there.
Thanks so much, Chris. I might be your first appointment because
come on over.
Because I've learned more today. I didn't think I could learn any more, but this has been a fantastic conversation. You just have so much knowledge, and hopefully our listeners will take away a lot of information today that they didn't know before either. So thanks so much.
Thanks both of you so much.